My next guest is Dr. Rick Hess. He is a scholar, author, and educator. He pins Rick Hess Straight Up for Education Week and Old School with Rick Hess for Education Next. He is a senior contributor to Forbes, executive educator, editor of Education Next, and contributing editor to National Review and author of books including A Search for Common Ground and The Great School Rethink. Dr. Hess started his career as a high school social studies teacher. He has taught at the University of Virginia, the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Rice University, Johns Hopkins University, and Harvard University. He is also the senior founding fellow of the Public Education Foundation's Leadership Institute of Nevada. Well, welcome to the podcast, Rick.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Good to be with you.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
This requires going back to the last century, but
Yeah.
you know, um, for me, one of my formative experiences was I was hired to teach in East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. I was supposed to start what was going to be the third advanced placement economics program in the state. The first year we didn't start it because they'd already filled out the grid and they didn't want to make the front office have to erase the whole grid and figure out how to do it. The second year, we were going to start it, but the challenge was that they had already built my schedule, and so there was no room to add the course, even though they had more than 30 students who had signed up. Um, I asked about it. I said, I'm willing to give up my prep period because this is something I'd love to teach. And my principal said, Mr. Hess, I'll tell you what, why don't you go take it up with Central? If they say you can work your prep, then sure, we'll do it.
Yeah.
I was 23 or something. I didn't know any better. So I drove over to Central at the end of this day, had what I thought was a perfectly pleasant meeting with like somebody in the district curriculum instruction office, and show up the next morning, and my principal's waiting for me at the edge of the parking lot, and he says, "Mr. Hess, what did you do yesterday afternoon?" I said, I don't know what I do, boss. He said, come with me. So we go and we sit in his office. He said, I just got a call from my friend, the assistant, blah, blah, for C&I. Did I understand that you went over and spoke at Central yesterday? I said, you told me to.
Yeah.
He said, Mr. Hess, don't you know I was kidding? And like for
Uh,
me, this was kind of the culture that, is so much a reality of so many teachers' lives that you're encouraged to take ownership and initiative. And then there are so many rules and so much covering your tush and so many kind of norms and practices that it just becomes punishing for teachers to actually do that. And, for me, I crawled out because I wound up going off and getting a PhD, which is a whole lot easier than actually having to show up and do the work every day. But I think for me, that was a really a formative experience.
yeah, yeah, especially as a brand new teacher, right? And not knowing exactly how to interpret it, and you just took it literally, right? So I think a lot of teachers,
Never
uh,
take it literally.
yeah, like you just wanted to do what's best and teach the AP class that you were excited about teaching. So I mentioned in the bio that a lot of your work is writing for Education Week, and yesterday, as we record, this is mid-December. You published an article entitled "No, the U.S. Ed Department Won't Be Abolished, but Here's What's Likely to Happen Instead." So as we record this, there's a lot of fear around the abolishment of the Ed Department. I've been to a few conferences in November. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts around why it won't be.
Well, sure. Let me level set first. I think it'd be perfectly fine if it was abolished. It was created by Jimmy Carter in 1979 as part of a payoff to the NEA from his 76
Mm-hmm.
campaign. And what folks seem not to fully understand is if the Department of Education were to go away tomorrow, it would have no impact on the lives of teachers and students in America's K-12 schools. The Department of Education doesn't educate anybody. It's 4,000, government employees. Mostly what they do is manage the machinery of student loans and financial aid for post-secondary education. Even if the department were abolished, all of that would still happen. It would just get moved over to a different federal agency unless it was outlawed. Similarly, the Washington only pays about 10 cents on the dollar out of K-12 spending. Most of that money comes from Title I or money for children with special needs. Those dollars would still flow. Abolishing the department would not stop those dollars. It would simply move them over to a different agency. They would have to be zeroed
Okay.
out. And
Sure.
nobody on the left or right wants to zero out money for Title I or children with special needs. So first off, a lot of this conversation tends to be more performative rather
Hmm.
than about the concrete impacts. The department's not going to get abolished, real simply, because unless you abolish the filibuster in the United States Senate, you need 60 votes in order to make a change like that. And there's 53 Republicans, and not even all of them are necessarily sure things for this. And none of the Democrats are going to vote to abolish the department. So it's not about whether you want to, it's about simple math. And the
Yeah.
math isn't there to abolish the department. So I think a lot of this conversation, a lot of these, a lot of the fear or whatever at conferences involves people actually looking up at the clouds for non-existent threats, when what they
Hmm.
really ought to be aware of are the practical changes that might be coming down the pike.
Hmm. Hmm. Talk to me about maybe some of the practical changes that you think will occur, whether or not the department is abolished.
Yeah. And honestly, like I said, if the department were abolished tomorrow, we would still be having the same conversation. So one big set of changes is that there is a possibility, it's not likely, but it's possible, that Congress would take a lot of the strings off of federal funds. So,
Hmm.
for instance, right now, anybody who works with Title I funds, either in the school or at the LE in the local school district or at the state level, knows that there are enormous number of rules: time and effort reporting, what used to be called maintenance of effort, now maintenance of equity. This is all the stuff where you wind up with Title I staplers and the non-Title I stapler. Um, all of those rules are written in order to ensure that that the relatively small amount of money that's actually Title I, which is actually about 2 cents on the dollar nationally, gets spent the way it's supposed to get spent. Um, there's a chance that Congress will do what's called move towards something like a block grant, or at least remove some of these conditions in ways that give schools and districts more flexibility in how they spend these funds. Not likely, but that's one thing that people should be aware of that might actually happen. The
Hmm.
second thing that's very likely to happen is that the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education is probably going to approach its work in very different ways that'll have a real impact on K-12. So, for instance, existing language under both kind of the Civil Rights Act and under the 14th under the Civil Rights Act says that schools are not allowed to engage in discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity or religion. The way that this has been interpreted pretty aggressively under the Obama and Biden administrations, for instance, is to go after a school discipline, arguing
Yeah.
that if there are statistical differences in the
Hmm.
rate at which, say, black and white students are being disciplined, that's ipso facto evidence of discrimination. Um, you're going to see a fundamental shift in that. That the question for the incoming administration is going to
Yeah.
be: is there evidence that students are being punished in ways that are unreasonable given
Hmm.
their actual conduct? So you're going to
Hmm.
find, I think, for instance, much more leeway for
Yeah.
educators in schools to make disciplinary decisions. What you are going to find, though, much more scrutiny of, for instance, is something like race-based affinity groups or
Okay.
privilege, where
Yeah.
there's an argument that, well, the standard is that educational practices are run afoul of the law if they create a hostile learning environment. And what
Hmm.
you're likely to see under a Trump Office of Civil Rights is folks arguing that something like organizing students by race for certain conversations, like Boston was
Hmm.
doing just a couple
Hmm.
weeks ago, um, inherently creates a hostile learning environment for students of one or more races. And so what's going to happen is school districts who have been used to thinking about civil rights enforcement in one direction are going to, for the first time, really, in memory, um, find that it's being applied in a way that's going to feel less familiar. And that's going to have big impacts, I think, curricularly, instructionally, and for school and district policies.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of just how we're approaching like funding, like a conference I was at was for world language teachers, and It's not under Title I funds, it's not under funds for ELD, but just in terms of money being given for particular like elective subjects. How do you think that might look? Would it be more the decision of the states if they abolish the department?
So 90% of school spending is state and local for K-12. The only two real buckets of big federal money are about the 20 billion a year for children with special needs and about the 16 or 18 billion a year for Title One.
Mhm.
That's the bulk of it. There's some otherwise kind of marginal programs. There's like Title II funds, which partially fund either class size reduction or professional development. Uh, but that's about 2 billion a year. We spend about 800 billion a year on K-12. So you're talking about a fraction of a penny in the typical school district. For what you're talking about, for instructional expenses, for staffing, one big change is that the emergency pandemic funding is running out.
Yeah,
And for some districts which treated that as kind of ongoing funding rather than emergency funding, there are going to be some budgetary holes. But those were
yeah,
always going to happen. And that doesn't matter if there's a department or not a department. It doesn't matter if Harris had won or Trump had won. There were no votes to kind of continue that $200 billion. And so there will be budget shortfalls in some areas in some districts, depending on how they've spent those funds. But more generally, yeah, whatever happens with the department, and again, just because I can count, I know the department's not going away. Those decisions are going to have little to no direct impact on things like world language teachers, or arts instruction, or science instruction, just because they are not a significant, they're not what federal funding actually supports.
Well, I think we've had a great conversation around funding around your article, and I think I would encourage others to visit your site on just more articles that you've written recently, and you're updating, I think, every week or so with new writing.
There's things are always happening, so we try to keep up.
Yeah, yeah. So out of everything we've talked about around your trench experience and just this article that was published yesterday, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I mean, I think, the point you made that, hey, you hear at conferences that apartment's going to get
Yeah,
abolished
yeah,
is it's very easy when you're doing the work in any line of work. It doesn't matter if you're a
yeah,
teacher or a soldier or a cop. You spend a lot of time with people who do what you do. You go to the same conferences. It's easy to wind up in a bubble without even
yeah.
realizing it. And so what I would encourage, if you don't, if these are the sources of information you're getting, people are
Hmm.
telling you the department's going to be abolished. People are telling you that your job might be zeroed out or your pension will be
Hmm.
affected. It's really important to just go and search out other sources of information.
Hmm.
Uh, Make sure you're finding folks who are coming at this from a different perspective, who might be able to enrich kind of your thinking about it or give you another way of understanding the challenge. Um, because for somebody like me, not only is there nothing scary about abolishing the department, there's about 100 people in the Department of Education Communications Office, each of whom makes over $100,000 a year. Um, if we laid all those people off, and that was another 10 million a year that was actually spent supporting learners in our schools, I think that would be a terrific thing. Um, you can agree or disagree, but I
Yeah,
think those are the kinds of perspectives that folks benefit from encountering, and
yeah,
it'll help them make sure that they're focused on the real changes, and really seeing what's coming down the pike, and not spending times being distracted by folks
yeah.
who may or may not have a good read on the situation.
Sure,
So
sure.
that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, like you said, inform yourself and look at other sources, talk to other people instead of living in fear. I think that's a big thing as we move into the next administration in 2025. Well, where can people connect with you, view some of your work, and find you online?
Sure. You can find me at rickhess at aei.org. If you're interested in my bio, just check out Wikipedia. If you want to hit me on Twitter, I'm at Rick Hess 99. And if somebody wants to hit me on Twitter, I will make every effort to kind of respond, if best I can.
Thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for having me on.